Today we have with us Richard Hudelson, who grew up in a factory town in East Central Indiana. His father and maternal grandfather worked at the Chrysler manufacturing parts for the assembly lines in Detroit. The rest of his family was made up of small farmers. Sorry to hear they were so small, but I'm glad they had farms. Dick escaped the factory, went to college and liked it, came to Duluth from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, and in the fall of 1977 took a teaching job at UMD. He taught philosophy at UMD until 1996, and then at UW Superior until 2011. He's now been retired for 10 years. He's the author of 6 books, 4 in philosophy and 2 in labor studies. Carl Ross grew up in the Finnish communist community in Superior, Wisconsin, and he recruited Dick to join him as co-author for a book on the labor history of Duluth. They worked on that book for 18 years. Carl died before the book was finished, but By the Ore Docks, a working people's history of Duluth, was eventually published by University of Minnesota Press in 1996. This talk will be based on his work with Carl on that book. Duluth had an ethnically diverse working class. Ethnic differences, religious differences, and ideological differences divided the labor movement in Duluth. Yet, it has been a powerful labor movement from very early on and even up to the present. So please welcome, and I commend to your attention, Dick Hudelson. And Dick is still muted, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I'll go back to mute here.
Dick, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. The little mute button that appears at the lower left of the screen had disappeared for some time. It's back. Before I forget it, in response to what Bill had to say, I remember during the Vietnam War when Bertrand Russell was very active on some kind of an international board or group that were talking about the wrongness of the war. And the Indianapolis Star, which was my local newspaper then, ran an editorial that said readers should ignore Bertrand Russell. He has changed his mind on many things. That was the argument. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, isn't that a virtue? So thank you, Bill. Okay, so I grew up in this factory town. My parents and and you heard that stuff. Okay. No one in my family was active in the labor movement. They were not hostile, but they weren't active. They were Methodists. The church I grew up in was not a reactionary church by any means. And there were a number of clergymen that I stayed around for adult sermons when I was like sixth grade or something like that, because I thought they were saying some very interesting things. So with that aside, I guess I should try to get this thing launched. And Bill's around and Dave's around, so maybe it'll work. Let's see here. Screen share is the first step. So far, so good?
Yeah, we see your slides. We just need to make it big, which probably means run it. I don't see the run button, but it's there somewhere.
Yeah, I'm trying to find that. Things are a little disorganized with this Zoom business.
Maybe the slideshow thing towards the...
All right here?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
There was a place that it said it was at 51%. The size was at 51%. It was along the bottom right.
I think it's working fine right now. Let's try it as you change slides.
I want to thank Dave and Jim for helping me get this thing done. Thank the Freethinkers for the invitation. Jim Noble, I looked at his talk on Marxism and socialism, why I'm a socialist or something like that, and agreed with about 90% of it. And that's really high. I think Dave will agree with me. There are no two philosophers who agree with one another. There's always significant differences. And I suspect most of you would agree with that, although you might disagree with much else I have to say. Let's see here. Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. I'm going to step back and set a kind of broader picture of Duluth. Duluth was an immigrant city. It had an immigrant working class. We'll get to Duluth eventually. Adam Smith, I've been reading his book on ethics. Come on, can't come up with the title at the moment.
Theory of the Moral Sentiments, I think.
Theory of Moral Sentiments. It was published 1747, something like that, the Theory of Ethics. The Wealth of Nations is supposed to be a spin-off that builds on his ethical theory. And that the Wealth of Nations comes in 1776. If I've got my dates right, that's like 30 years later and near the end of Smith's life. Smith's argument had two basic points so far as I see it. One is that free markets and private property will provide incentives for people to innovate and to produce more so that the pie grows bigger, and that makes for potentially bigger slices for every individual. So that's good. The other argument was a freedom argument, that the system of markets and contracts between consenting people increases the realm of freedom for the working class. They're no longer tied to the soil. It's no longer illegal for them to leave one master and enter into a contract with a different master. So Smith, the Theory of Moral Sentiments is loaded with comments of well-wishing to the poor and to the working people. I don't remember the death time for Smith. I believe it's somewhere around 1795 or so. I don't know, somewhere in that area. Smith was optimistic about the future and the way this thing would work, but it didn't take long for it to become clear that that wasn't the way things were actually working. The next great economist after Smith is David Ricardo. He wrote the Principles of Economics. It's not the title. Anyway, that was in 1819. And his conclusion was that there is an iron law of wages, and that is whatever is necessary for survival. And that will be the situation that the working class is in forever. It's like a natural law in chemistry or physics, on his view. You can't alter that fact. It's just a fact of life. That's the way things are. Along comes Marx, significantly later. His Capital doesn't come out until 1863 or something like that, volume 1. Marx's position is that the laws of economics are not quite like the laws of physics or chemistry, in that humans, to some extent, they are based on human creations, human laws, human rules, human traditions. And this can be changed. Anyway, I grew up in this town, and there were frequent layoffs, so that the whole town basically would be unemployed at the same time. All the factories in town, and there were maybe 10 of them, were tied into the auto industry in one way or another. And I remember being puzzled, why are we shut down here? Why is the town shut down? Why is everybody looking for work? People need cars, people need jobs. What's the problem here? And that led me to read some Marx. I was in high school at the time. And I had a kind of eureka experience that, aha, now I understand what's happened. And from roughly the same time I was giving up God, I was embracing Marx. Now, one further comment here. One thing I came to understand about Marx as I read a lot more was that he liked Adam Smith and he liked David Ricardo. He regarded them as genuine scientists in pursuit of the truth, good-hearted men. There's nothing particularly wrong with them. He did criticize what he called the hired prize fighters of capitalism. The Donald Trumps of the day, no, that's not fair. Not fair to the economists. But I'll move on from there. The Peterborough Massacre I'm lousy with dates, 1819. In Manchester, I believe it is, there's a St. Peter's Square, and they renamed it the Peterborough Massacre to echo the Waterloo Massacre. Around 60,000 people had assembled, and they had two demands. One was food, and the other was the right to vote. The yeomanry, and I don't really understand exactly what that term means. It's not regular troops. It's sort of something like the National Guard. It's local, and they attacked the crowd with horses and sabers. And only 8 people, I think, were killed, but some 700 were badly hurt. This is the point I'm trying to get across is it became fairly early obvious that the free market system was not providing a prosperous, safe, secure life for the vast majority of people. The result was the Chartist Movement, which demanded the right to vote for working people. Now, back to Jim. Well, no, I'll come back here. And now we have Marx and Engels' Manifesto of the Communist Party, which comes out in 1848, just in time for the revolutions of 1848. Those were extremely complex years in all the countries where eruptions occurred of various kinds. But at least one part of that was the problem of poverty, mass poverty, hunger. That's part of the reason for the emigration that comes to Duluth. Hunger, poverty, lack of opportunity of any realistic kind. One of my daughters married a guy who's from India. one of the things that I've discovered in reading in the history of India is how the British rule in India changed things, and not all for the good. There's a reason why India has the spinning wheel on its flag. You can trace this historically. The power loom originates in Britain, in England, I think it is, and makes its way across the channel into Europe. And everywhere it goes, you find massive unemployment, destruction of the home weaving and home spinning industries that had been the source of food on the table and a roof over your head for a lot of people. One of my favorite lines is from a Heinrich Heine's Song of the Silesian Weavers. As the power loom and the equivalent of the spinning wheel came to Germany and Silesia, which was a textile industry area, massive unemployment. And there's a line in the poem, the Heinrich Heine poem, which has the people cursing God for their fate. Just to get across the idea that innovation, technological innovation was certainly spurned. Adam Smith was right about that. Spurned is not the right word, but provoked, encouraged. But as that technological innovation spreads across the world, it has devastating consequences. Now, the happy read on that is creative destruction, but that's totally insufficient, since often this destruction lasts for 100 years or more, and it never stops. We're in a wave of it now. Places, especially Africa, is being depopulated as land is taken over by the Chinese and by other outside groups. And people are fleeing in search of jobs, in search of a way to make a living. The Chartist movement was also a working class movement. They didn't have the vote, they wanted the vote. They thought if they had the vote, they could change the rules and make the system work better for a greater number of people. There were some other takes on what to do. One was a kind of Christian utopianism, if I could put it that way. The Oneida community in upstate New York was one example of that. They rejected all private property, even in spouses, which is interesting. Another version of that is Etienne Cabet, the French thinker. This book is True Christianity, published in 1846. Another book published 2 years later is Voyage to Icaria. And you get a lot of Icarias in the States, in the United States. Immigrant groups would come and try to establish a sort of idealistic Christian community in the United States where land was cheap. What really caught my eye here is, I can't put my finger on it, but toward the, above the Bonheur commune, happy commune, I don't know. You see to each according to his needs as you face it on the left, and from each according to his forces, which I take it to be from each according to his abilities. This is a classic phrase that Marx picks up in one of his later writings. It's the Krieg of the Gotha program, which was adopted by the non-Marxists in Germany. And anyway, I was surprised to find this phrase that Marx embraced, as a, not for the immediate post-communist or post-revolutionary society, but for some distant utopian possibility, from each according to ability, to each according to needs. Where did this come from? Why is a Christian embracing it? Well, it comes from Acts 4, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I won't bother reading that. You can look it up. I'm sure you all have your Bibles handy. And Christians did recognize the needs for reform. The Catholics, the Protestants, what was the date on this one? 1891, 1909, I think. Finally made it to Duluth. This is the book that was mentioned, that Jim mentioned in introducing me. The photo is a group of coal dock workers, and beneath it is a photo of the ore docks. I want to read to you a passage from By the Ore Docks. This is page 8 if you're interested. We give a list of churches that were built in Duluth in the 1880s. Duluth took off in the 1880s. That was when it was really established as a viable city. The list of churches built is 26 churches long. Some of them are Catholic. They're serving Irish, Poles, Germans. Most of them are Protestant. They're almost all Swedes, Norwegians, Danes. We have the Swedish Baptist Church, the Swedish Methodist Church, the Swedish something or other. Anyway, there are these 26 churches. Now here's the line that I want to read, if I can find it. Impressive as this list is, it is important to keep in mind that many of the immigrants coming to Duluth lived outside the orbits of the various churches. According to one estimate, 3/4 of Swedes emigrating to America maintained no affiliation with any church. Similarly, only 1/4 of Finnish Americans chose to belong to any church. When C.B. Newcomb, superintendent in charge of construction of the first grain elevator in Duluth, attempted to lead his crew of 200 largely immigrant men in prayer at the start of the workday, quote, he would get a boot jack, a loaf of bread, or a fish hurled at his head. This is a not uncommon response to the difficulties of the times. People were not in a mood to praise God for how good God was to them. They're here, they're at the bottom of the heap, and they don't believe in this stuff. This is a pamphlet that I worked on, and I've got it up here only so you'll know where the next page comes from. Duluth is being rebuilt in 1800. The churches are being built. They also are putting in gas lines and water lines and infrastructure kind of stuff. You can see on the left, the guys in coats and ties. They would be English-speaking people representing the sort of ruling elite of the city. In the trenches, you'll find Italians, you'll find Swedes, and other Scandinavians, and Finns, and a variety of groups, Poles, Germans, whatever. I won't go into the details of the strike. This headline gives you a good idea. Only 3 people were killed. One of those was a bystander, a teenage boy. 2 of the strikers, and another 30 of the strikers were wounded. Half the police force was wounded in this shootout. But because the police had high-powered guns and the rioters had lower-powered guns, the damage to the police was not serious. The strike had the support of much of the different ethnic communities. There's not one ethnic community, there are multiple ethnic communities. They're divided by language. They're divided by religion. They're divided by what kind of food they eat, how they dress, do they like booze. So there was a Knights of Labor group in Duluth that welcomed all working people, men or women, black or white or Chinese or whatever, all ethnic groups. They did outlaw lawyers, I believe, but that, so far as I know, everybody else was welcome. But a Knights of Labor meeting at Knights of Labor Hall in West Duluth would take a long time. A speech would be given in Swedish and then in Polish and then in Finnish and so on. And you could see how that would drag things out. This is a portrait of the family of E.G. Swanström, one of the wealthiest Swedish businessmen in Duluth at the time. Swanson supported the strikers, and he got them organized. The strike failed. A trial was held. The jury refused to convict any of the strikers, which gives you some idea of the extent of support for the strikers. Swanström, a businessman, the wealthiest Swedish businessman in Duluth at the time, at least that's what our book claims, supported the strikers. He, after the strike, he also went further. He tried to throw out the old mayor and elect a new mayor who would be more sympathetic to the immigrant working class part of Duluth. They won. They won the election. The first thing they did was to fire the chief of police, hire a new chief of police. And the second thing they did was to change the rules on the use of guns. Sabrina Aiken. She comes to Duluth from Iowa in the mid 1890s, 1894, I believe. I was working with old bound volumes of Labor World, and at the back of these volumes, I found these scraps of paper. I had been trying to find a photo of Sabrina Aiken, but I never found one. And then I put these together, and I'm thinking this is the face of Sabrina Aiken, and nobody has quarreled about that yet. She came here single, or technically married, but her husband was a salesman and he was off on the road somewhere and he never shows up in Duluth. She had one child with her. Within 2 years, she has managed to begin Labor World, the oldest labor newspaper in Minnesota. She's also doing organizing for the lumber pilers on the docks. That would be men who are working, loading logs for the sawmills. She was also active in organizing the laundry girls in Duluth, women who worked in the commercial laundries, and in a variety of ways. This is one of the very early issues of Labor World. You can see people struggling with lack of food on the left of the upper part of this photo, as opposed to a prosperous family enjoying a meal with waiters and so on the right. And the capitalist is sawing off the limb of industries and mills and so on from the tree of labor that keeps it all going. My co-author, Carl Ross, was born in Hancock, Michigan during the copper strike of 1913. His father was a printer for Tuomis, which was the paper of the Finnish labor movement. The title of this book, published in 1903, I believe, is The Hammer of the Proletariat. And notice what the hammer is. It's a ballot being dropped into a ballot box. And that reflects the position of the Second International Socialist Movement, which was Marxist. The electoral path to socialism is what they're after. One of the things that Jim Noble commented on when he gave his talk was a list of proposals from the Communist Manifesto that Marx wrote in 1848. And there's a list of 10 possible reforms. Marx says, these measures will of course be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. And then there's the list of 10 proposals. None of them involves a command economy. They all leave a free market structure in place, but they put on what has come to be called guardrails that make the system work better for a larger percent of the people. I wanted to highlight this sentence. We have seen this, I'm quoting Marx here, from 1848. We have seen that the first step in the revolution of the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to establish democracy. And the way it was understood is the electoral path to socialism. And socialism is not a command economy that's going to be put into effect right away, but an economy way off in the distance somewhere, possibly. Who knows? It's an open question. But there are these reforms that Marx lists, 10 of them, that Jim Noble pointed out. We're still in that situation. Let me frame it. This reflects my position. After the Second World War, we finally got democratic control of the economies in the advanced countries. It's what the French call the 30 glorious years, from roughly 1945 to 1975. And then somehow things start going the wrong way. The Reagan Revolution here, the what's-her-name revolution in Great Britain, and neoliberalism spreading around the globe, kind of undoing what had been accomplished. Back to Duluth history. This is the Domestic Workers Union. This is kind of an interesting group of women. They have prolonged contact or long contact with the ruling English speakers. They work in their homes. They see how they live. By and large, they speak pretty good English. They become leaders of a lot of the labor movement groups because they're in a better position to know what's going on with the other side. Well, I'll keep moving on. They were also members of the IWW. The Industrialist Printing Company was a Finnish organization made up of hotel, domestic, and restaurant workers. And they are part of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. Hence the name of the company, the Industrialist Printing Company. They're printing works like the Communist Manifesto, the works of Kautsky and other Marxists of the times. Fred Jackola, the man who was the president and signed at the bottom right here, was one of those arrested in a repressive government sweep for opposition to World War I and sentenced to a long term, I think 20 years, at Leavenworth Prison in Kansas. This is the Finnish Work People's College in Riverside. This building, somebody's bought this building and has restored it. Am I getting in trouble about time here? Does anybody know what time it is?
Okay, I think.
Okay. It originally was a seminary for training Finnish-speaking theologians in the United States and was located in St. Paul. It moved up to Duluth because the center of Finnish population in this part of the world was in the Duluth Superior area. So they moved the college up here. The socialists take over and it becomes a workers' college. The socialists are in competition with the IWW. The socialists favor an electoral path to the future. The IWW wants organized labor strikes, industrial actions, on the job. They kind of dismiss the ballot as ineffectual and useless. I started to say, go down to Clyde Landing in Duluth on the St. Louis River and take a boat out, 50 yards or so, and look up on the hillside, and you'll see this building in pretty good shape, still standing. Two of the teachers, well, hang on. World War I comes along. At the end of the war, the international Marxist movement splits into two factions, the communist movement and the social democratic movement. Tuomis, which had been following the electoral path, embraces the communist path, and it becomes a communist newspaper. I moved to Duluth in '77. I didn't know a soul. I went to Norway Hall. I was single, to a dance where they had a Irish Cayley band. I met a Swedish girl who introduced me to a Finn, and the next thing I know, I was putting up sheetrock at the Finnish camp up on the range. And I met, well, it was then, at that time, 1977, still a communist newspaper and still in Finnish. This is a really interesting group. Notice they're largely young. They emigrated from Sweden after the failure of a strike in their hometown. Ljusna on the Baltic coast of Sweden was a lumber town. They came here. I don't know how they ended up here, but they did. This is the active core of the Scandinavian Socialist Local in Duluth. It was one of the largest Scandinavian socialist locals in the United States. The newspapers they're holding are the Svenska Socialisten, a national newspaper for Swedish immigrants to the United States. They became one of the founding locals of the American Communist Party. William Leighton Cars is an interesting guy. He was a railroad engineer. Not sure what his ethnic background was. He was an English speaker. He had memorized passages from Shakespeare and a lot of other British lit, and was articulate. He was elected to Congress, 8th District, in, what was it, 1918, under the platform of the Union Labor Party. It was influenced by the progressive NPL. Some of you are going to have to remember that for me. The group that was in the Dakotas, largely made up of farmers. This becomes sort of the basis for the Farmer Labor Party in Duluth, but it's before the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party was formed. They won. I had some notes and had something in mind to say about that, but I'm going to just move on. This is another one of the pamphlets that I've helped with. Herb Widdell grew up, he was born in Duluth, but he is the son of Swedish immigrants from Värmland. After trying some other things, they began running boarding houses for male Swedish workers in Duluth. Tremont Hotel for a while, and then another one that I can't remember the name of at the moment later that was a little better. Some interesting stuff. This is a page from that pamphlet. Notice mention of Swedish Lodge. The lodges were prolific. Every ethnic group had its own 2 or 3 lodges. And they were often hot spots for both religion and the labor movement. Notice at the bottom, it talks about the Midsummer Festival in 1928. There were 25,000 people there to hear U.S. Senator Henrik Shipstead sing the Swedish anthem in Swedish. I've later been told he didn't actually sing it, he just said it. But at any rate, that's a lot of people, a lot of them. The Swedes were clearly the largest immigrant group in town, and very important. KKK. This was the reality of life in Duluth, as in a lot of the rest of the Midwest and the rest of the country. Let me back up a bit. Labor, the gunfight that opened up this talk led to labor winning the government control. They won the elections and basically ruled Duluth from 1900 or from 1890 to 1900. They were divided on, do you drink? Scandinavians, a lot of them were pushing for temperance, prohibition. Are you Protestant or Catholic? There was a strong anti-Catholic organization among Protestants in Duluth. The American Progressive Organization in the 1890s, and in the 1920s, the KKK. Swedes were unfortunately taken up with this at the time. And that tends to divide the labor movement, all of those issues. Another issue I should mention was there's what's called scientific racism. I'm sure some of you have done some work of thinking about that. And you get this hierarchy of races with the Aryan Nordics at the top, and then it goes down, 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 and everybody's got their place in the scheme of things. The main goal of the KKK in Duluth in the 1920s was to make sure that Catholics didn't hold any public offices, were not hired as school teachers, and didn't contaminate the community with their leadership. The Catholic Church in Duluth had a Bishop McGolrick who was very sympathetic to labor. But now you've got labor divided by the ethnic hierarchy. In the steel plant, you had to be Protestant, Nordic to get a good job. People like Italians, South Slavs, African Americans got the bottom jobs. That's why they all lived in Gary, New Duluth. They were not welcome in Morgan Park, not until, I couldn't give you the exact date. There's a book on Morgan Park that'll explain that all to you. I didn't have anything to do with it, so. Let me back up. So in the 1920s, 1926, there's an election for Attorney General in St. Louis County, I'm sorry. Attorney General in St. Louis County. The candidates were Sig Slonim, a Jewish man who had done heroic work in support of the labor movement in Duluth. He was defeated by Powell Brown, a barkeeper who is also a member of the KKK in 1926. So at that point, things are still pretty divided along ethnic lines and religious affiliations. Now we're going to jump into the 1930s. The Depression, the election of FDR, unleashed this incredible upheaval in Duluth, in politics and in the labor movement. The CIO organizing drive just went all across West Duluth, organizing in plants that had never been organized. You have a generation people who were born in the United States, went to public schools, mingled with other ethnic groups. There were a lot of intermarriages. Well, things changed. And you get this, from the point of view of the labor movement, incredible, wonderful growth in the 1930s and 1940s and into the early 1950s. The man, as you're left, as you face this photo, is Ilmar Koivunen, a Finn, also a member of the Communist Party. In the back of the room, there's a woman two women are standing next to one another. The woman with the vest-like structure on is Irene Paul. She and her husband, Henry Paul, are both Jewish, or were both Jewish, and both were great activist in the cause of labor. She becomes the Midwest editor for Midwest Labor, a publication of the CIO. She also wrote some fiction that is pretty good. Now, I'm only bringing this in. Okay, here we go. John Kobe is Slovene, I believe. He worked at the coal plant, or at the steel plant. He was also active in the SNPG, the Slovenian National Benevolent Lodge, and the Yugoslav Socialist Federation. This is a membership card that I found in some papers that are in a Yugoslav collection at the Immigration Research Center in the Twin Cities. I want to mention this. The name of the Slovenian lodge was the Leo Tolstoy Lodge. Now, some of you probably know more about Tolstoy than I do, but he had some sympathies for that early true Christianity that Etienne Cabet praised. John T. Bernard, elected to the United States Congress in 1936, served 2 years representing the 8th District of Minnesota. He was from Corsica, of all places, probably Catholic in religious background, but he was a part of this upheaval, the labor movement, the political change of the 1930s. He voted against a moratorium on shipping arms to defend the Spanish Republic, and he was the only vote in Congress against that. And so he was booted out in 1938. He had been working as a fireman in Duluth at the fire station and he was blacklisted. He couldn't get his job back because of what he'd done in Congress, voting to support the Spanish Republic. His campaign leader or director in Duluth was Vienna Johnson. Her mother had been one of the founders of the Finnish Socialist Federation in Hibbing, Minnesota in 1906. Vienna Johnson went on to have a state position in the Farmer Labor Party. She was one of those purged by the McCarthy era in the early 1950s. I saw one source that listed her as a communist. I don't think she was. During the period of the war between Red Russia and Finland, the Winter War of 1940 or so, she was raising money to support the Finns against the communists. And I can't imagine anybody would be in the Communist Party and doing that publicly. This is one of the last, this is probably the last picture in this screen show. This is again that Swedish group that I was so interested in, the young people. The black man is a man that group, that Swedish local, brought to Duluth to talk about the racial injustices of 1918 and that time era. The woman who has a black skirt and a black top, and the other woman has her arms around her, is Minnie, come on, what's the last name? She's the wife of the editor of the Truth, the socialist newspaper published by this local in English, so it can reach more of the workers. Everybody can read it in Duluth. I came to Duluth in 1977. I fell into this left-wing group in town. I was happy to do that. I made a lot of friends. And a lot of them were active in the fight against redlining that was going on all over the country before 1977. So a lot of them were blackballed. They were victims of the McCarthy era, but they were still out there fighting. The Dizard family, some of you may have known them. He was blackballed because of suspected communist affiliation. He worked at Diamond Tool. But they were, the Dizards were active in this. The family that lives across the street from where Eileen and I live, the Klebers, they were Quakers. So this kind of, again, I think there's some overlap between Marxism and the ethics of what I think of as Jesus' teaching. Solidarity, love your neighbor. Now, this is probably the place to stop. So let me just call it quits for that. How'd I do, Dave, on time?
Perfect. Thank you, Dick. I had a question about if you're willing to take questions.
Oh, yes.
I had a question about, it occurred to me as you were speaking that there's a tension. So, between political interests of a group and the economic interests of a group. In particular, I think the most important production that most of us do is reproduction. And in the case of a group who are part of the economic inputs, say labor, the economic incentive is to have fewer. I mean, the value of labor depends upon how much is available. And the more that's available, the cheaper it gets. So, but political power depends upon numbers. So if you're a labor leader, you would like everybody to make 10 babies who will add to your future political strength. So it seems to me there's a built-in tension between these two, and that in general, there wasn't any interest by the labor movement to restrict the supply of labor and laborers. Does that sound right? Or how much of that sounds right and how much sounds wrong?
There's a long history of this argument about, I don't think reproduction in the biological sense, having families, maybe increasing the population, maybe has a long-term effect on population, but much more of an issue for labor is technological innovation. And it's the same mixed side. It's good in principle. Marx praises capitalism for increasing the productive capacity of humankind. We can do more with the given resources. The problem is that as technological innovation takes place, people get laid off. They get replaced by machines. It's as though, people think that the automation problem is something new, but no, it's been with capitalism from the beginning. That was kind of where I was trying to start out with my talk. Anyway, those innovations have a bigger impact on labor than human reproduction and population growth. But it's like you said, there is a contradictory thing there. On the one hand, it's good. It has the potential to make life easier for more of us and to make more possible for all of us. The problem is that under free market structures, that's not the outcome you get. It takes some kind of regulation, some kind of guardrails. to make the system work better. We had a fairly good system in place in the 30 years or so after World War II, but it's coming unraveled. Even Sweden is under pressure to liberalize, and what that means for them is more free market oriented.
So Dick, I have this is Charles, and I've got another question for you. You know, you related a lot of the divisions in the labor movement in the early 1900s, divisions by language, divisions by religion to some degree. I was wondering to what degree those divisions were hostile or were simply communication issues. If you could review that a little bit.
I would say there was somewhere in the middle there. The word prejudice comes to mind. I interviewed quite a few people over the years, and people would chuckle when they talked about how their parents or grandparents just couldn't imagine socializing with people that used garlic in their cooking or put some kind of slick grease in their hair. I've lost track of your question. I'm sorry.
So the degree to which there was hostility involved. You mean today in labor issues, we see efforts by some people to make sure that, you know, working class whites and working class blacks don't get together, that they essentially see each other as competitors. And I was wondering to what degree that was true in the early labor movement in Duluth.
Not true in Duluth, especially in Duluth. And the reason is because they were all in the bottom, pretty much. I mean, there was this stratification, that's true. If you were Nordic, you had a chance to get ahead. But let's see, let me back up. I don't, like in the Knights of Labor, the Swedes were very active in the Knights of Labor. So were the Finns, and both groups were, well, I don't know about Finns. There was a ruling by a federal court that said that the Finns were actually Asiatic and could be sent out of the country under the Asian Exclusion Act that was passed around 1886 or so. I don't remember vigorous racial, ethnic hatred, just sort of disdain or prejudice.
Okay.
The bosses were doing the hiring. The bosses were putting people in these slots.
I'd like to add
They were
something.
educated.
Hello?
Hello.
When I grew up in Minnesota, and I grew up surrounded by Germans mostly, but Norwegians and Swedes and everything stirred together. And of course, we know now that the type of socialism that was in Minnesota politics didn't include dark-skinned people, but where I lived, there weren't any. So what I noticed was, as I was growing up in Minnesota and learned more about what was going on in other states, not necessarily the whole country, but other states, is I realized by the time I got out of high school that Minnesota was the influence of so many Scandinavians who probably brought that more way of thinking instead of way of thinking, socialism, kind of soft socialism that wove its way through Minnesota politics for so long. In my mind, I always considered, until the last 20 years or so, that was a great benefit to Minnesota citizens in general, that there was this historical influence of socialism in our DNA, so to speak. So Minnesota, and again, when you're young, you don't know what's going on all over the place. But you know, our school lunch programs, I found out, were, oh boy, they're really good compared to other states. You know, I mean, there was attention paid to things that the Minnesota Miracle governor, what's his name that died, and now anyway, in the late 50s and 60s, that was all really soft socialism that was going on. And unlike some other states, many other states. So I think we were influenced by those ethnic groups coming to our state, but I don't know how much.
There's a, I'll have to look it up. There, yes, I agree. I agree strongly with that. I think the Scandinavian influence on Minnesota has been good for us.
I don't think it's working I don't think it's as strong anymore as it once was, but 20 years of right-wing radio poured into the state, and things changed.
Yep. Yep. It's part of that downslide I was talking about.
Oh, okay. Well, some people think it was an upslide, you know.
Competing for jobs now.
Mm-hmm.
And people.
I'm sorry, Dick, did you notice in your research whether the churches were divided along class lines? So for example, for the Protestant denominations, there are East Duluth churches and there are West Duluth churches. And the question would be whether the Lutherans and Methodists and Catholics were divided on how much they supported labor, depending on where the churches were located.
I would assume that would be so. Most of the immigrants come from countries where you had an established church, and from what I've seen, the established churches were seen as the churches of the ruling elite. And so the non-establishment churches were seen as free churches, is a term that was often used in Europe, excuse me. But a sort of similar thing here. They were much more likely to embrace the labor movement than the established churches. Now, Bishop McGulrick, well, but I guess his following in Duluth would have been largely with Irish, Italian, Polish, working class people. So it's not odd that he would be supportive of that. So yeah,
Richard, I have a question.
Yes.
Was it customary back in the 20s to carry about a boot jack to hurl at somebody with a opinion that you disagreed with?
I doubt it. I could give you the source for that quotation if you're interested in pursuing the author of it. But the point I was trying to make is that there was a large part of the immigrant working class in Duluth that did not have firm religious affiliations. And that was confirmed. The research on that, again, I could look it up and give you the quotation. I cannot give any confirmation for. Who would, maybe a dead fish, and who could throw a dead fish?
Yeah, I find that equally incredulous.
Yeah.
And a loaf of bread I'd keep for myself, but.
Yeah. I threw in the quote because I thought it was funny, but.
Did I just hear a loaves and fishes reference?
You did.
Dick, was the American Communist Party's position explicitly anti-religion, or did they temper that for political reasons?
Unfortunately, this is one of the ugly features of communism, and there are several. But one of them is that the official line depended upon what Stalin was saying at the moment. I've forgotten the question here.
Just wondering about the American, yeah.
Well, let me just add this bit. I tried to weave in, but somehow left out. In the late 20s, the official line coming down from Moscow was, do not compromise with the right-wing socialists or the non-communist movement, workers' movement. Don't do that. The communists reversed course sometime in the early 30s and advocated the broad popular front, which became popular at least by, or in the communist world, by say the mid-30s. In Duluth, they ignored the instructions from Moscow from the period of roughly 1927 to 1935. Communists just formed alliances even with the AFL, which was on the far right of the labor movement. That's how William Leighton Cars got elected way back in 1918. Of course, at that point, Stalin hadn't risen to power and wasn't giving commands, but their inclination in Duluth was to work with anybody that was willing to work with them. Now, there is one cartoon that I had thought about including in this talk. During the period of the Spanish Civil War, Tuamis, which was then a communist newspaper, had a cartoon of the Pope pushing a machine gun or rotating rifle or something or other, I don't know just what it was, against the Spanish Republic. But in general, this is one of the reasons that Duluth has inspired me so much, and maybe it's because of the Scandinavian influence too. They were trying to be constructive, to build a future that would be viable for everybody, and we're willing to work with across ethnic lines. This is especially true of the what are sometimes called second generation immigrants, the sons and daughters of immigrants who aren't so locked into by language and tradition and so on, the past. Now, that was a long-winded reply, but for good or bad.
The animosity between Catholics and Protestants was, of course, not just if it would, to the degree it happened in Duluth, it sounds like it was more mild than the United States in general. Protestants and Catholics never really got together very much on anything until they decided to use abortion for a political issue, and then it kind of united them. As far as I understand the history, that began in the 80s. But before, if you go back into the 50s and 60s and 70s, depending on where you lived, a lot of voting was for or against Protestantism or Catholicism within the candidate itself. Isn't that so?
Yeah, I think I would sympathize with that. Kennedy was the first Catholic to be elected, John Kennedy was the first Catholic to be elected as president of the United States. So at some sort of national level, there was an anti-Catholic bias that wielded some weight. The town I grew up in, I didn't experience anti-Catholic sentiments. Not in the church I grew up in either. Or anti-Semitic sentiments. That may be because Jews were very rare in the part of the world I grew up in. But
Well, the Ku Klux Klan at one time, the second rising of the Ku Klux Klan in the 20s was huge. It was all over the Midwest and every small town in the United States, and it was anti-Catholic.
yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Yeah.
Well, folks, it's 11:30, and that pretty much brings us close to the end of our time together. First of all, I'd like to thank Dick for coming down and telling us so many new things about the history of labor in Duluth. And next time, if I remember correctly, we're going to hear from FFRF on Christian nationalism. If that's not right, somebody will jump in and correct me, I hope. So that's June on the first Sunday. So please come back at that time and bring all your friends and so on and so forth. And in closing, thank you very much, Dick.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Well, thank you all. I hope I'll see some more of the rest of everybody in the future. So have a good day.
And just in time, I'm having company here pretty soon. Okay, all right.
Say, Dick, you have time for an after question?
Sure.
Let's see if I can remember what it was. It was something about the churches and their anti-communist stuff. I was actually wondering if in the Cold War. Oh, I had another question. It was why. So you mentioned the puzzle you had early on about why the town you grew up in came to a halt during recessions or auto overproduction or business cycles, whatever it was. Why didn't the labor unions, when they had strength in the 50s and 60s, why didn't they negotiate contracts that required, something the equivalence of tenure and other protections from when things are bad?
Couldn't have won it. Could not have won that demand, because that would make each company way too vulnerable.
Oh, so okay, yeah, it would have to be a demand that applied to an entire industry. But unions in general represented the labor in an entire industry, not just in a specific plant, right, or company?
For a while they did. I think this is one also a problem with the structure of the labor movement in the United States. There were silos, industrial silos, if you can speak it that way. In some of the other countries, Western European and Scandinavian, you have contract negotiations at a much more general level. It's not industry by industry that sort of set up standards and plans for the future, 5-year plans, that kind of thing. And then on down, you negotiate contracts that help your situation, your industry manage to survive within that framework. But I mean, there was what was called the Treaty of Detroit. This was the 1950 UAW contract with the auto work industries.
Mm-hmm.
And basically it was an agreement that wages would track developments in productivity. As increases in productivity took place, workers would get a part of the pie, so to speak. That Treaty of Detroit then bled over into a lot of other industries. It became sort of the gold standard for the US economy. It was about 1970 or so that the auto industry abandoned the Treaty of Detroit. In the town I grew up in, the workforce, about half of them were permanently laid off by 1980.
Mm.
And since then, to the best of my knowledge, all of the factories are gone. The jobs were exported. This is another problem that's driving me up the wall. How do you manage things in a global economy where there are no governments that exercise global jurisdiction? Democracy. I mean, how do you apply democracy to global markets?
Mhm.
I'm stuck. If any of you have any helpful suggestions on that one, please give me a call.
Well, when I thought about these problems of technological dislocation, say you want greener production because of climate change, but you have all these people that work in oil fields and coal mines and the transportation of coal and all that kind of stuff. So I think you don't want to have barriers to the changes. Like, you do need to shut down the mines. And it occurred to me that one of the problems may be that unemployment benefits are administered locally. They're not administered nationally. So the incentive of every state is to retain these people in the state rather than help them move to a place perhaps far away where they could find employment. So you always wonder, why are people sitting in West Virginia when those mines are not coming back? And part of the reason is that they don't have help to move out. Instead, they're getting money that's conditional on them staying where they are. Same thing with our Iron Range. The money is administered to stay where you are, not to relocate to some place where you might get employed. Does that seem crazy or part of the problem?
No, that strikes me as about the way the world works. We sort of set up some rules that look like they might work, and then conditions change. I don't know how. I have no constructive answer. Yeah.
Well, the globalization's been fantastic for the poor people of China and other parts of Asia. I think that in China, the 30 million people, maybe it's 300 million people, have moved into arguably the middle class from the lowest possible class. But it's hugely dislocative, all these people coming from villages to the big cities and so forth. But if you think about, we've paid some of the price in our industrial areas, but if you look at it internationally, it's been for the better for perhaps a lot more people.
Well, we do have the largest flow of economic-driven would-be immigrants in history at present. And more countries are locking down and not letting them in. And I have no solution. I wish I did.
Well, lots of people are worried about these problems. If there were any easy solutions, presumably they would be proposed and maybe even adopted. There are always these trade-offs everywhere you look. If you just can't, there's pluses and minuses for every plan. Maybe this gets back to Bill Guzzi's original reflection on people like black and white solutions, and the real world requires compromise and a lot of grayness.
I agree with that.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad you did this. It was so interesting just to learn about the tidbits and to put human faces on some of our history. What a great thing.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Have a good Sunday, everybody.